I know a number of you have been here before. Welcome to those of you who are returning, and welcome to those of you who are new. I tend to speak kind of quickly sometimes, so if at any point I do that and you're like, what the heck did he just say? Just wave at me and I will slow down and repeat. That's not a thing on your end, that's a thing on my end. What we're going to go over today primarily is some Russian foreign policy issues. We'll talk about three primary areas. We're going to talk about nuclear policy. In particular, there's some new announcements Russia just made a few weeks ago about its nuclear capabilities. We'll explain what those are, why they matter, and the effects they have. Second, we're going to talk about proxy wars that Russia is currently involved in. The two major ones that we're going to look at are the ones in Ukraine and the ones, and the ones in Syria. And then finally, we'll talk a little about cyber warfare, or its slightly downgraded cousin, cyber espionage and cyber manipulation, which is election type stuff, but other issues as well. So as we go, if you have questions, feel free to throw your hand up and just let me know about them. I try generally to have a fair amount of discussion type stuff involved, so when we have time at the end, I'm going to generally try to broach issues and find out what you folks think we should do about this stuff, because one of the points of democracy is we're supposed to actually, make decisions about things. So I'll try to help with that a little bit. Let's start off on nuclear development and nuclear weapons. So, you are probably familiar with nukes as a thing that both the US and the former USSR, Russia, have. We got a lot of them. And there are a couple different things that have happened if we rewind to about 2001 that have directly affected current nuclear policy. We're going to start off with something called the ABM Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. It was something that was signed in 1973. And it was an agreement between the US and the USSR at the time that restricted what kinds of ballistic missiles we would each develop and what kinds of responses to ballistic missiles we would develop. It's a treaty that was in force since then, but then Bush withdrew from it in 2001. The major reason is because the ABM Treaty restricts missile defense, or at least specific versions of it. I've talked a little bit about that in previous times when I've been here, so for some of you this may be a bit of review. But ballistic missiles, so let's rewind a little bit as well on nuclear tech. So I make a nuke. Yay, I have a nuke. Or oh gods, he has a nuke. I have a nuclear weapon. If I want to get it to my opponent, what are my options for getting it there? Talk to me. How am I going to make it happen?
Long-range ballistic?
Yep. Put it on a big rocket and go boom. Rocket is one option. How else am I going to get it there? Submarine. Put it on a sub, on a rocket, or a missile, get the sub over, and that's your third option for nuclear deployment. You put it in a brown Honda SUV and you drive it across. Your third option for deployment is what? What's the other way you can get it there? Airplane. It's the only way we've actually ever used a nuclear weapon in war, or anybody has. Put it on a plane and a bomb and you drop it. There are downsides and upsides to each of these options. Downsides to planes. Any thoughts? Yeah, air defense is a thing, and it's actually a thing that we're pretty good at. We have like top-notch fighter jets, we have top-end land defense. Those sorts of things either work in a war, a full-on war where you can provide a lot of air cover against an opponent that doesn't have a lot of air defense, or they work against lower tech countries that don't have solid air defenses. But outside of that, dropping nuclear weapons via plane, not always your best option. How else can you do it? Yeah?
Standoff cruise missiles extends the capability of bombers from now.
True. We'll get there in just a second, actually, in terms of cruise missiles. So ballistic missiles, any ideas what the upsides and downsides are? Yeah?
They have like the SAD and the Aegis.
And that's exactly where we're going next. Very good, you know your stuff. So we're going to get to missile defense in just a second and deal with those and why ballistic missiles the preferred option. Any idea why submarines wouldn't be the preferred option in a lot of cases? Super expensive. Really effective, but really expensive and hard to maintain in terms of tech. It's flat out harder to do and harder to maintain a lot of those. This is why countries like North Korea have very limited submarine capabilities, if at all. Come on in, sir. Somebody outside. That's why smaller countries that are more rogue states have more limited capacities there. Russia, fully equipped submarine force as well. But the big way that most people pursue trying to deploy nuclear weapons is via what's called a ballistic missile. Ballistic missile, huge rocket that fires across multiple continents potentially. ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, are the kinds that go a really long way. So Russia has a lot of these. So does the US. Ours is the Minuteman III is what we've got. It deployed in silos around the country and in other places. Russia's also got a ton of them. Missile defense, which is what Cam mentioned, I remember the name, it contains a couple different things. The basic idea with missile defense is One side launches a missile, and the other side launches another missile that hits it and blows it up before it gets to its target. Make sense? There's a slight problem here, and that's that physics can be a little sticky. In particular, you're basically trying to hit a bullet with a bullet, except bullets don't go this fast. ICBMs fly at incredibly high speeds. They usually exit the Earth's atmosphere. They fly through outer space for a period of time before they re-enter, and you then try to hit it. So you got to do two things. You got to figure out where it is, and then you've got to have a missile that is so accurate that it can get to exactly where your target is and blow up at that time. If you miss it by a tenth, or in some cases a hundredth of a second, it is miles away from where your interceptor landed. So really tough to do, but theoretically possible. During the 70s, come on in, welcome. During the 70s, and actually during the Reagan administration as well, we experimented with an alternate system. Instead of launching a missile to hit a missile, we thought about doing, if you all heard of the Star Wars project, which was not the awesome or terrible, depending on whether you're talking prequels or not, movies. It was a system where that was supposed to be a joke. Y'all can laugh if you want. It was a system where we'd put satellites in space and we would try to use high-intensity lasers to, if not destroy, at least damage or mess up incoming nuclear weapons. Never got off the ground, never happened. Maybe it'll happen sometime in the future, but so far, our options for missile defense include a couple things. We have basically three layers. We've got the Patriot defense system, which uses Patriot missiles. They are designed to shoot down short-range, slower missiles. They work fairly well against rockets or smaller end things that aren't going way above the Earth's atmosphere and whatnot. We have Patriot systems in place in Japan. Israel has something parallel to them. The US has something like that. Pretty accurate, but can't deal with the kinds of huge missiles that Russia might launch our way. Our second option is the Aegis system. Come on in, grab a seat, sir. The Aegis system, which is something that we largely have based on destroyers. At sea, there's a land-based one that we've developed recently. It's a high-end, very complicated radar system. Because remember, the big difficulty with shooting down a missile is you need to know exactly where it is at exactly the right time, or you're never going to hit it. The Aegis system helps us do that. And it works with medium-range missiles, but again, things that are this fast and flying this far, Aegis can't really deal with. And that gets us to what's called THAAD. THAAD, Theater High Altitude Area Defense. This is a system that the US has just deployed in North Korea. We also, in South Korea. We haven't gotten it in North Korea to deploy it. That'd be a whole different thing. But yeah, I know, I'm a little ahead of myself. We've just deployed it in South Korea about 6 months ago or so. We have batteries in Alaska and Hawaii as well, and a few other places that are probably classified. So THAAD, what it does is it's a very intense radar system. It might give people cancer, we don't know, that projects a narrow cone of radar. And you know how if you ever see like movies where they show a radar screen, there's the sweep going around, right? It's not exactly parallel, but that's basically pings of radar going out. We send a radar wave out, it hits the thing and bounces off of it, and we can tell based on how long it takes for it to get back to us where that thing is, right? And so if you send waves like once a second or so, you can generally, you see the beep, 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 the thing moves because that's based on the waves coming back. That's not exactly accurate, but it's close enough. THAAD sends them out at hundredths or thousandths of a second intervals, so we can know very, very precisely where something is. It also isn't tremendously accurate so far, depending on who you talk to. If you talk to the people who make the system, they say it has a 100% accuracy rate. Absolutely has never failed and is perfect. Come on in. If you talk to anybody else, they go, in tests run by the company who made it with clear skies where they knew exactly where the missile was coming from, could plot it on a separate trajectory, had no interference, no outside EM problems, even then they didn't always get it. So it's a sketchy system. Eventually one day it may be super awesome, but so far it's not great. Coming back to where we started with the ABM treaty. The ABM treaty said you can't make missile defense systems like that. Any idea why we would agree to that? Like, why would we want that? Yeah.
Because when you start making missile defense systems, you upset the nuclear balance, and that actually makes nuclear war more likely.
You're going exactly the right place. This has to do with mutually assured destruction. Something I expect since many of you may have lived through the 60s and 50s, you may have an understanding of in a more direct and personal perspective than I do, right? Duck and cover drills were before my time. But the basic idea here is if I have a nuclear weapon and you have a nuclear weapon, and we can both hit each other, we both know if either of us launches, the other side's going to launch too, we're all going to die, and nobody wants that. So because of that, because we can both assure one another's destruction, nobody launches. With me so far? If I can stop your missiles from hitting me, though, my destruction is no longer assured, which means I can nuke you with impunity, at least in theory. Do you follow why that might be scary to the person we are looking at and pointing our nukes at? That was the idea behind the ABM treaty, is we didn't want anyone to develop a system like this, because if they did, that would make it possible for them to hit the other person without being hit back, and that might actually lead to a nuclear war, because then we have to act preemptively. We have to hit them before they can even launch on us, and that leads to us nuking each other for stupid reasons. Not there's really a good reason to end all life on the planet, but that's beside the point. Y'all with me in general on what the treaty did, and the reason Bush pulled out of it is he wanted to develop missile defense systems. One thing that's important is our missile defense systems are not intended to counteract Russia. The easiest way to get past them, and that actually gets, I think I put this on the next bit here. Yeah, so US missile defense. Patriot we covered, Aegis and THAAD, endangers mutually assured destruction, and did I get to the next bit? No. So there are a bunch of ways to get past missile defense systems. The simplest way is in order to actually have a chance to shoot down a missile, we actually launch about 4, 5, or 6 separate interceptors with the idea that one of those 6 will be in the right place at the right time to blow it up. And even then, we're not all that great at it. So if we're launching 6 interceptors for every missile that's coming in, and we have, say, 600 interceptors, how many missiles do you have to send for us to not be able to deal with it anymore? This requires math. I'm very sorry about that.
600.
Yeah, 6 to 1, you could send 11 and we're screwed. So the issue, the easiest way to get past missile defense is just to overwhelm it with more targets than it can deal with, or with a number of decoy targets. There are a lot of ways around it. A country like Russia, who has hundreds, so easiest way to beat it, overwhelm it. Russia has hundreds of missiles they can launch. We're never going to be able to stop them with this system. What we can do with it, potentially, if it works, is stop a few missiles from Iran or North Korea or something like that, or stop an accidental or rogue launch from Russia. Their deterrent is gone, and we can nuke them without being hit in return, and that's really scary if you grew up during the Cold War, and even if you didn't. So, easiest way is just to overwhelm it. But, more recently, come on in, welcome. Russia has focused on different ways to do it. Once Bush pulled out of the ABM treaty in 2001, our intelligence indicates that Russia had begun developing different countermeasures to get around our missile defense system. Putin announced a number of those countermeasures were in final testing at basically the equivalent of the State of the Union for Russia. That was a week or 2 ago. A couple of those systems. First, nuclear-powered cruise missiles. This gets a bit to what you were speaking about, sir. Cruise missiles, so ballistic missile, think ballistic trajectory in physics, right? Boom. Sound effects not included. Ballistic missiles up into space, go down and hit. Cruise missiles launch and then skim along the surface of the planet, sometimes only a couple hundred feet off the ground. They can follow terrain, they can stay close to water, they can sometimes stay under radar. Cruise missiles are pretty impressive. But one of the big limitations on cruise missiles, and on any rocket or missile for that matter, is fuel. Because the further you want the rocket to go, the more fuel you need to put in it. But the more fuel you put in it, the heavier it is, which means you need more fuel to get it to go further, which means it's heavier, which means you need more fuel, etc. You get to the point where it ends up being so large it isn't aerodynamic and can't fly at all, so there are limitations to how big and how far a cruise missile can travel and how long. We're always getting better at those, but that's the basic issue. Russia found a way around this. We also kind of found this way a couple decades ago, but decided not to pursue it for a couple reasons. What they've done, they claim, and it's likely this is probably true, though it's still in testing, they have placed a small nuclear reactor inside a cruise missile. And the energy from that reactor is what fuels the rocket rather than solid rocket fuel, which means you don't have to keep adding tons and tons of fuel for it to keep going. Why this matters is this means they can launch a cruise missile, which can then stay airborne for an incredibly long, arguably infinite time period. Well, not technically infinite, like radioactive decay will get it in a couple thousand years, but basically as long as they need it to or longer. So they can launch it, instead of going straight at the US, can take a detour around like South America, come up, say hi to the people over in Central America, skim through the Gulf, surf in the sand, and then come on over and hit Washington, D.C. if it wants. All of these things enable it to evade our missile defense systems, all of which are fairly narrowly targeted, right? Remember, X-band radar had that thin cone on the THAAD system? They can avoid that cone of radar by taking a long route around it, which a normal missile wouldn't be able to do because it doesn't have the fuel to afford a huge detour. So this is the first thing that they announced. The other downside to this is it puts out a lot of radioactive material as it flies, which is why we decided it wasn't a great idea, because now you've got a reactor that's spewing out radioactive stuff behind it. You can clean it up a little bit, but the more you try to clean it up, the bulkier the missile is, and the less effective it's going to be. Russia, from what we can tell, went with the kind of dirty version of it. One of the ways that we can verify they're actually doing this is we've been able to detect increased levels of radioactive material in the air over certain parts of Siberia, which are consistent with the test flight of a missile like this. So that's this issue. Russia's developed a cruise missile that can evade our missile defense systems, all of those types, and can hit us fairly effectively. It's probably not operational yet, probably won't be for a few years, but they've made a lot of progress there, and they've gone a lot further than we had expected. Second option, nuclear-powered submarine drone. This follows a somewhat similar principle. Come on in, welcome. Follows a somewhat similar principle, and that's the idea that submarines have limitations to them. Subs are cool, they can stay underwater for a long time, but eventually you need, air and food and stuff. So they eventually have to surface or have to go to port and have to dock. If you take a drone, no people, which means you don't need air, you don't need food, none of that stuff, and if you can put a fuel source on it that doesn't run out, i.e. a nuclear power source, which is what we do for most of our subs on the high end anyway, but put a nuclear power source on an unmanned or uncrewed drone, it can stay underwater indefinitely. And the idea is not only can it take a long route around to get to places, but it can function as sort of a weapon of last resort, in that it can be cruising under the ocean and it can have protocols in it that say, if you don't hear back from Moscow in 10 years, nuke DC. So if at any time we actually do hit Russia and take out their command and control, they have a retaliation strike waiting, is the idea. Again, probably not entirely operational yet, still in testing phases from what we can tell, but kind of scary and kind of an interesting sort of last strike weapon. Also, because it doesn't ever have to surface, it puts out a lot less heat. It can also stay underwater and just kind of sit on the bottom for a long time and make it all but undetectable, at least if it's not moving. So potentially scary last strike weapon that's been developed. Third, hypersonic warhead. So you have y'all have heard, I assume, of supersonic jets, right? They fly faster than the speed of sound. Sound barriers, this thing, like sound only goes so fast, yeah? So you have supersonic stuff which goes a couple times the speed of sound. Like we've got some of our fighter jets and attack jets, actually in particular spy jets, can hit Mach 2, maybe Mach 3, sometimes a little bit above. Mach is speed of sound. So they can go a couple times the speed of sound. ICBMs can go up to 6 or 10 times the speed of sound by the time they're doing re-entry. Those are the big missiles. That's pretty fast. Hypersonic weapons, we're talking 20 times the speed of sound. So the idea is that they've got warheads now, or at least a warhead potentially, where they launch it on a missile, a ballistic missile like we talked about initially. It hits the atmosphere, and then when it re-enters, it accelerates even faster than it had been going. And that just makes it too freaking fast for our countermeasures to deal with it. Remember, again, X-band radar, we're sending out all these pings to see exactly where the thing is. The radar systems we have, the really advanced ones, send out more pings, but that's to deal with something that's going 10 times the speed of sound. 20 times the speed of sound, you need twice as many pings to know exactly where it is, and our technology isn't anywhere near that yet. So that's the other potential issue that they've recently announced and recently developed. The big question that kind of looms over all of this is why? Right, when they can already beat our missile defense system by just sending more missiles than we have interceptors, why bother with any of this? Any ideas? Are they just nuts? I mean, maybe some, but yeah. What do you think, sir?
Two reasons. One, they're liars, as always.
Possible.
Two, They just want to make sure they protect themselves if they have a backup.
And there may be truth to both of those. Russian propaganda and, well, now it's the ISB, but the KGB does a fair amount of that kind of stuff. Based on what we've seen, it is likely that they are at least at some stage of development on some of these, but it may not be anywhere near as far along as they claim. Fair point. In terms of protection, yeah, it's another, if our missile defense system is better than we have advertised, then yeah, this might be necessary. I contend there may be another reason. What do you think, sir?
Our encroachment, or NATO's encroachment in Russian territory.
Yeah.
Former Soviet territory.
Definitely, and when we get to Ukraine, we're going to go over that in some detail. We'll also look at some of the other Soviet bloc nations and what may happen there. That, again, persistent threat. Any other, but again, they can deal with that, right? They can hit NATO and blow up the world with what they have. Why else?
The claim was under Reagan that we got the Russians to spend themselves into bankruptcy trying to respond to our military.
Yep.
They may be trying to do the same thing of laying out all these things, which would be tremendously expensive to defend against.
Yes. That's one. I was going for two answers. You've got one of them, sir. And that's that. Remember, our missile defense system, we're sending 6 interceptors to a single ICBM, and the technology involved in the detection and interception is much more expensive than the technology involved in a single nuclear weapon. They also only need a single one of these in existence for us to have to design an entire detection network that can sweep the planet in order to counteract it. That's a pretty big skew in funding. Yeah.
It probably helps Putin keep control.
Yeah. This is the big one that I was going for. Arguably, these are all functionally domestic policies. The title for the session that was advertised is What Does Putin Want? This is a lot of it. He wants power and control and adulation. He wants to restore a sense of Russian pride. That's something that resonates massively with the population, in the same way that Trump's Make America Great Again resonated with a good chunk of the American population. It's that same instinct of nationalism, which is oftentimes buttressed and held up by military technology. That's why big military parades, whether they exist here or elsewhere, exist, is a way to say, our country is bigger and stronger than you. You have to pay attention to us. We are relevant. If you look at some of the actual quotes from Putin's speech, it's people have ignored us before, they can't ignore us now. It's that sense of national pride and that their nation is a major player in the world that underscores the vast majority of Russian foreign policy. That, along with the idea of reconstituting the Soviet Empire. That's something there's a bit more of a split on, but there's still a strong desire within portions of the Russian population to reclaim sort of the glory days. Mike, going all right?
Yeah, I'm done.
Oh, sweet. I saw another hand back there. Yeah.
Fine.
Yeah.
If Russia, uses one of these warheads against some of the countries adjacent to it,
Yeah.
why would they do that?
Oh, they won't. It's game over. Anybody launches a nuke, the world's gone. Like, realistically speaking, if Russia launches, the US will launch in return. As soon as the US launches, China will launch. As soon as China launches, India will launch. As soon as India launches, Pakistan launches. The world turns into a microwave and the cockroaches inherit the earth. So launches of any kind are very unlikely. And that's, again, what I think supports this as a political stance more than a military stance. It's politics done through military showmanship and military technology rather than military technology for active military use. A tangential conversation we could have, if we had time, or at a different time, is about US nuclear policy and why we maintain the degree of nuclear weapons we have now, when in reality it's far more than we would ever need to use. A lot of it is that nationalist pride, even though they're counterproductive and bad to use otherwise. Let me keep moving now. Actually, is it related here? Because if so, I can take it.
I was just wondering,
Yeah.
a piece of it is, weapons is such a big piece of their economy, it's creating jobs.
That as well. No, legitimate point. There's definitely an economic incentive. The military-industrial complex is not unique to the United States. Other countries got that going on too, and Russia's definitely one of them. Fair point. And the degree of corruption and oligarchic control in Russia is part of that too, in that there are a lot of major weapons manufacturers. Russia, incidentally, is the second largest weapons dealer in the world, behind us. But the second largest weapons dealer in the world, and a lot of the people who make most of the money off of that are people who are part of Putin's inner circle. So there's a big incentive then to make those people richer. Fair point. So, as mentioned, all of these are likely still in development. Any final questions on the nuclear stuff before we move to Ukraine? I know we're overviewing things a little bit quickly, but I want to try to get into as much as we can. Yeah?
Can a nuclear weapon be assembled in a place, brought in by people and assembled? Is that the threat?
Yeah. So great question. Let me see if I can answer it in a couple specific ways. So there are a few things you need. Actually, I'm going to rewind a bit. Two types of nuclear weapons, by and large, that exist. You have strategic nuclear weapons and tactical nuclear weapons. Strategic nuclear weapons are the things that turn cities into smoking craters. Tactical nuclear weapons are the things that turn large parts of cities into smoking craters. It's a fuzzy distinction, but generally, tactical nuclear weapons tend to be in the hundreds of kilotons range. Kiloton is 1,000 tons of TNT would be required to get the same amount of explosive power. That's 1 kiloton. A lot of the US tactical nuclear weapons are in the 1 to 10 kiloton range. Strategic nuclear weapons sometimes go into the megaton range, which means you would need 1 million pounds of TNT to replicate that size of an explosion. So megaton strategic nuclear weapons, probably not. Both the mechanism to do all of that and the parts are just not really doable. Tactical nuclear weapons, maybe, largely because our screening at our ports in particular isn't very good. We're decent on our borders, despite some of the rhetoric that you hear, but our screening, and we're pretty good on air transportation for those sorts of things. Our ports we're not so great at. So theoretically possible, but the chances that it gets caught are fairly high, and you do need people to assemble everything properly in order for it to work. You don't just throw uranium on top of a bomb and light a fuse. There's a bit more that goes into it. So there is an outside threat there, though I think it is a lower level threat, partially because we can generally take a pretty good guess at where the radioactive material in the weapon came from based on what we know of the different places it can be mined around the planet, which means we can generally get a pretty good guess as to who may have done it after the fact, which makes it a very risky move for anybody. But fair question, and definitely I think if we were having a separate session on US border security, I would go very hard on ports being massively under-secured. I think the most likely way the US will ever get hit with any kind of nuclear attack is there will be a bomb on a ship that will pull into New York Harbor and detonate, because we have zero defense against that. We'll be able to know exactly where it came from afterwards, then the whole world, cockroaches inherit the earth. We've covered this. But that's, I think, the most likely way it might happen. So let's talk about one of the other ways that Russia is projecting power internationally. It's not just saying we have bigger, scarier weapons than you, but it's also them becoming a relevant player in parts of the world they had previously either steered clear of or had been forced out of. So we got Russia here, we have Ukraine here, we have Crimea down here, which is kind of part of Ukraine, depending on who you talk to now. We also have a number of other former Soviet bloc countries. They go further east here as well, in addition to Georgia, Armenia, etc. So the main reason I wanted to show you this map is because this chunk here, Crimea, is incredibly important. It contains Russia's only port with solid access to the Black Sea, which means if you want to deal with anything going on in this area, you need the port there. And up until now, Ukraine has leased that to Russia on a semi-permanent basis, well, until a few years ago. But there's always the chance Ukraine could say, nah, we don't want the money anymore, bugger off, in which case Russia's in trouble. Additionally, Ukraine looks something, oh no, we're going to do the history, then I'll give you the breakdown of it. But up until about 2014, Ukraine was its own country, it did its own thing. Here's the story from Soviet Union breakdown to today. I'm going to go through this a little quickly because we actually did an entire thing on this 2 years ago that took 2 hours, so I can't go into all the detail. But I want to give you an overview so you generally know who the players are and what's been going on there. So, USSR breaks up in '91. Around about 2004 in Ukraine, you have what's called the Orange Revolution. It's basically a move for more democratization and more westernization of Ukraine. It puts a government in power that works for the most part. Ukraine has one really big problem, well, a number of problems, but one really big problem governmentally. And that's that transitioning from socialism can be rough. And in particular, under the socialist system, people paid a ton in taxes. By and large, private employment didn't exist all that much. But the government provided tons of subsidies for lots of things. So for example, your gas bill, your heating bill was entirely paid by the government. And when you live in this part of the world, that matters a lot. So once the government changed, and once after the USSR broke up, the new government that took power needed to figure out how they were going to deal with that. Because if you're not going to take all the people's money from them, you don't have the money to pay for everything. No one, however, wanted to be the politician that cut off the gas. The same way that no one in the US wants to be the politician that ends Social Security or scales it back, or scales back Medicare, right? It's a program people love, super expensive, may not be entirely sustainable, but everybody wants it, and no one wants to be the one who shuts it down. So as a result, Ukraine has been subsidizing gas bills for everyone in the country for decades. Guess where it gets its gas from? Bing! So that means Russia has a ton of control over what happens in Ukraine, because they can literally turn off the valve, because Gazprom, which is the company that controls all of it, is technically under the control of the Russian government, which makes, and is also, there's some Putin cronyism in there too. Gazprom. It's spelled like Gazprom, but with a Z. Yeah. What's that?
I think it's a Z, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a Z instead of an S in there. So Gazprom, the major Russian petroleum company. So Ukraine has kind of been at the mercy of Russia despite the breakup from the Soviet Union. Now the Orange Revolution, and the reason that really matters, is that's when Ukrainians finally say, screw it, we're not going to deal with Russian meddling anymore, like no, we broke away for a reason, and they start electing pro-Western leaders to run their country. Russia isn't happy. Russia cuts off the gas for a while. There are negotiations. It eventually gets turned back on. But it represents a definitive move by Ukraine away from Russia's orbit to start moving closer and closer to ties with Western Europe rather than Eastern Europe. In 2018, this is one of the other big precipitating events, George W. Bush pushes for Ukraine to be considered as a NATO member. Remember, maps matter. Hey, look who's next door. NATO existed to contain the USSR. Granted, USSR doesn't exist anymore, but Russia's largely taken its place geopolitically, though not at the same level. The idea that Ukraine, which is immediately on Russia's border, and remember, contains the only Russian port, only deep-water Russian port that gives them access to the Black Sea, the idea that that country would go to their enemy was a terrifying prospect in Moscow. So, a couple things follow from there. We consider them for membership. We ultimately decide, nah, it's not the time. We're not going to let that happen. But even the idea that that would be proposed was a really big concern. So Russia starts messing with the government. The 2008-2009 financial crisis happens almost immediately after that. And that sucked here. It was significantly worse in other parts of the world. Remember, Ukraine at this point is still trying to pay everybody's gas bill, but now almost all of their financing just evaporated because of the global financial crisis. So they're in major trouble. The Ukrainian economy tanks, and the people are not happy. So the person who had been in power, not Yanukovych, but Tymoshenko, who was the leader who had been in power in Ukraine, she ends up getting the boot because people are like, you didn't fix the economy. Why does the economy suck? We're going to go with somebody else. Tymoshenko, or Yanukovych rather, who's a pro-Russian leader, is elected. He's basically saying, look, if we buddy up with Russia again, we'll get lots of free stuff from them and it'll all be fine. And people are upset enough about how things are not working out now, they get behind him. Economic stuff continues to get worse and worse. And in 2014 is when things, in technical terms, get crazy. Here's how. First off, in January of 2014, there were big protests, the Euromaidan protests. There are big protests in Ukraine asking for closer ties to the EU and to Europe in general. A lot of this is over trade and over loans. Remember, Ukraine needs a lot of money at this point, got to keep paying the gas bill, and so they have two loan packages they're considering, one from Russia and one from the EU. These protests are a bunch of people in Ukraine, a huge portion of the population, saying, we want to work with the EU, not with Russia. We remembered what happened when you get in debt with Russia, it ends badly for us. Let's not do that again. So these protests pop up in a big way in January. In February, they eventually kick Yanukovych out of power. And as a result, Russia goes, that's a problem. The guy who was basically covering us there, he's gone. We got to do something. Again, we're at the risk of losing the port that we need in Crimea. So Crimea secedes, or is annexed, depending on who you talk to. The Russian story is that a bunch of people in Crimea, which is this area, say that they don't want to deal with the European-leaning stuff. They want to go with Russia. And there are a lot of patriotic Russians who, entirely separate from any encouragement or support of the Russian government, happen to decide to take vacations in Crimea at the same time with their AK-47s. or Kalashnikovs, depending on how you talk about it. And they all show up there, and they start agitating and fighting on behalf of Crimea and saying, we want to secede from Ukraine and become part of Russia. This is not so happy-making for the people in charge of Ukraine. That gets us here. Conflict widens. It's not just Ukraine, it's not just Crimea that's in conflict initially. That conflict begins to spread out to other parts of Ukraine and risks becoming a full-fledged civil war. Talks in Geneva try to tamp that down, try to find some sort of compromise, have moderate success. We start throwing sanctions on Russia for basically annexing Crimea shortly after that, and then we start ratcheting those sanctions up as a result of the talks. And that gets us to November. In November, mysteriously, heavy weaponry like mortars and artillery from Russia starts showing up in Ukraine. Which again, Russia says, we don't know. Maybe it was left over from the Cold War, who knows. Russia denies any official involvement. I mean, maybe somebody just wanted to drive there and they couldn't find their car keys, so they took their launcher. You know, who knows? They show up. Russia denies official involvement. The rest of the world is somewhat skeptical. And so that gets us to about 2015, where Crimea has had a couple referendums of dubious legitimacy, officially has said it's now part of Russia, and Russia's been like, if you really want to join us, I suppose we'll let you. And we will protect you against the rest of the world that clearly doesn't respect you the way that they should. Come, rejoin the fold. And so Crimea does. There's a stalemate, largely a ceasefire. There is still some degree of low-level violence going on in Ukraine between pro and anti-Russian forces. But for the most part, this is back down to a simmer, which is where we are now. The US threw a bunch of sanctions on Russia up here. And we've largely kept them. There are questions over whether or not they will remain under President Trump. He's gone back and forth, which is not too unusual, on whether or not he would like to maintain those or change them, and in what way that should happen. So we honestly do not know if those sanctions will remain or if they'll change. Yeah?
I don't know if you want to touch this, but when did Paul Manafort get here?
You know this guy, he and Manafort are buddies. Paul Manafort worked with, and this is actually part of what makes this particularly interesting, Manafort worked very strongly with the pro-Russian portion of Ukraine, and depending on which stuff you buy, may have been involved in them overthrowing the previous government and taking power there. So a lot of deep connections in that particular area. One thing I do want to do, though, is I want to give Russia their due here in a couple ways. First, they basically took part of a country and got away with it. I will admit I am somewhat liberally biased. I disagree with Obama on some foreign policy things. This is probably one of them, in that there was not a lot of pushback from the international community about it, the US included. And that risks what you were asking about in terms of Russia potentially expanding its ambitions to other former Soviet bloc countries. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Georgia. All of these different areas are potentially vulnerable to Russia doing something similar. Now, Russia's argument is this, and I don't believe it is true by and large, but I think there are grains of truth to it that may mean that the situation doesn't replicate in other places. This requires maps. So, this is the linguistic divide in Ukraine, based on a portion of the population that speaks Russian as their native language. You may notice some geographical tendencies here. Sevastopol, that's the port that I kept talking about in the Black Sea, that's in Crimea. All of this area, Russian-speaking primarily. And there's actually a reason for that. That was under Stalin, one of the ways he dealt, because Ukraine has had a strong sense of national identity, more so than some of the other Soviet bloc countries. And so part of what Stalin did in order to deal with that is he forcibly migrated a ton of Russian farmers by the millions into Ukraine and basically implanted them there. And they've been there since then. So that southern portion and southeastern portion of Ukraine is populated by people of Russian ancestry by and large, or people who have acclimated to that culture and have largely adopted it. Here's the second map. This is political divisions. You may notice some slight similarities. Map 1, map 2, map 1, map 2. Anything anybody notices? Yeah. This chunk, Timoshenko was the more western candidate, very much in this area. Yanukovych, almost entirely in the Russian-speaking area. Ukraine is a country that is divided as much by language as by culture and by history. Now, again, that division doesn't go back in perpetuity. That's a division that was deliberately exacerbated at one point, but it has led to massive political splits along those lines as well. Go ahead, sir.
This is repeating itself. For example, just one example. the Italians took over history under Mussolini.
Yep.
The Yugoslavs come in and kick them out. My problem is, why did we just stick around the Ukrainians, did not kick out the Russians? They didn't belong there to begin with.
Yep. And a lot of it is several things. First is about capacity. And when you're dealing with the USSR, it's slightly bigger. Like Mussolini had a heck of a lot of power in Italy at the time, but the relative comparison of strength is different. The other thing is nuclear weapons didn't exist in the same way. And there's a legitimate concern under the USSR, especially at the height of the Cold War, that if you push back too hard, they may just wipe you off the planet. And part of it also is a fairly consolidated campaign to undermine the political structure on the other end of it. So yeah, a very good historical discussion that's worth getting into there that I'll admit my expertise starts to peter out at the edge of. But they're excellent questions to ask. And going forward, this division between Ukraine is going to continue to have significant effects. The reason, and here's Russia's argument, they say that the reason that this secession happened is, first of all, back to the linguistic end, huge connection to Russia there. Again, strategically on Russia's part, they made it that way decades ago, but huge connection there. And so they argue that there is not another country in Russian orbit that has this same tremendously stark division of heavily Russian identified people compared to folks who are not. And they are about 85% right on that. Like, there are a few other countries where there is a somewhat obvious split. Estonia has a few pockets that work that way, same with Lithuania, but nothing on the level of Ukraine. And so they argue that what happened here is not something that will happen anywhere else because the unique cultural and linguistic divide, they claim that the Russian-speaking people of Russian heritage there, were being persecuted and were being oppressed, and so they stood up for them. It was almost certainly a more political calculus than that, but nonetheless, they say that same kind of divide doesn't exist elsewhere, and so it is unlikely that the same justification would be used for intervention in other places. I think there may be some truth to that. Go ahead, sir.
That's the same argument Hitler gave going into Austria.
Yeah, it's a popular one when you have power and you want to take it from other people. But, yeah, again, legitimate question of how I would say that my opinion, so this is not objective fact, this is purely me speaking as me. I think that while there are definitely people who, in Russia, who have an interest in protecting those folks because of what they see as shared ties, I think the decision was definitely one based on strategic international interest. At the same time, I think that it is less likely that Russia will try to annex any other countries in the same way because since there are some grains of truth to this explanation, it gives them some degree of international cover that they would not have elsewhere. Additionally, one thing might be an aberration. Two things in a row becomes a pattern, and that makes it almost impossible for the international community to ignore. So again, I think the possibility that absent some other kind of provocation or something else that would draw it out, or clear opportunity, I think it is fairly unlikely that Russia will try to seize other portions in the same way, though certainly not impossible. Any further questions on Ukraine? I know we're covering at a very quick level here. Yeah?
Well, we have to remember that the nation didn't really exist back during the Tsarist Russian Empire. It was an economic region, and Crimea and those other areas of the east were not part of it.
Yeah.
So when Russia, after World War II, established the Soviet Union, their economic region of the Soviet Union, they were not integrated.
Yep.
Sometime during the Khrushchev era, he actually made a gift of Crimea to Ukraine.
Oh, I missed that. Huh. Fair enough. So more of an artificial creation.
Integrated. So when the Soviet Union fell apart, I guess the UN must have been involved, but all of the borders that were established in the Soviet Union stayed in place.
Yep.
So that could never really be integrated. All these other problems occurred because of it. The three regions that you showed of contemporary Ukraine is a result of those particular borders after the Soviet Union.
Makes sense. Good observation.
So, the Russian populace was pushed into Crimea rather late in the game, but there weren't originally no Ukrainians there either. They were the Tatars that migrated from the steppes.
Yep.
So the economic history has great domestic weight within the Soviet Union.
Fair. And the other thing that, just as a brief tangent on there, if you'll sometimes hear people refer to Ukraine as the Ukraine. That phrasing is from when it was simply an economic region of the USSR rather than a country unto itself.
It's only recently become a nation.
Yep. Though Kiev has always had, like, historically, a chunk around it that has sort of been its separate territory in some ways, but larger discussion.
Part of different empires.
Agreed.
Same as Poland.
Fair.
They-
Discussion I want to pull us back from, because I think that's a really interesting history thing that we could spend an hour and a half on, and I got to keep moving.
Yeah, of
But yeah,
course,
fair observation.
Ukraine, what, 1990 as a nation?
Yeah, officially. I want to keep going from here. We will circle back at the end if we have spare time for other questions here, if that's all right. Because I need to talk a little about Syria. Yeah, go ahead, sir.
How different was the voting division when Timoshenko was thrown out by an election?
Fairly similar, actually. It was just an issue of turnout changes. The broad pattern in all of those areas stayed pretty much the same. So it was what portions turned out more or less, not what they thought, but how many of them showed up at the polls. At least as far as I understand. But I'll admit I haven't looked into that one quite as much depth. I could be wrong, so feel free to look more.
Dirty tricks too.
Now that too. Let's talk Syria. So I'm going to take one of the most complicated conflicts in the modern world and boil it down in like 10 minutes. So forgive me when I oversimplify the crap out of a lot of things. You got a bunch of different groups fighting in Syria, and a lot of this is sort of resolving in some good and bad ways now, but there are 4 major groups I want to focus on. First, you got the regime forces. So this is the official Syrian army. This is Bashar al-Assad's force. Russia is backing this group, largely because Russia had been backing Assad for a long time as one of their proxies in the region. They just continue to back the government now. Second group, Syrian opposition. The reason I have it in quotation marks is that it's something that is fairly loosely organized, has a lot of different groups that don't always agree on everything. The only thing they really all agree on is they want Assad out of power. That's pretty much it. Beyond that, what they want to do about that and how they want the new government to work and who should fight and whether they're Islamically affiliated or not, all of that is up in the air. But they're largely US backed. So the US has occasionally provided funding and in some cases non-lethal and occasionally lethal supplies to the Syrian opposition. So when we talk about them, that's this group. Third, the Kurds. In Iraq, we've been big fans of these folks. In Syria, we've been a little more hands-off, though we have helped them a bit. We have a history of, so the Kurdish people, just as a quick aside, the Kurdish people exist in an area there that doesn't have their own state, though they have a defined ethnicity. They are historically fairly strongly oppressed in most countries they live in. Syria, Iraq, and Turkey, and to some degree Iran, are the major areas where you can find them. Turkey has a big problem with these folks. Because a decent chunk of Turkey is Kurdish, and they would love to have their own state. And they have engaged in domestic terrorism and political activism both in the past. And so Turkey really not happy with the Kurds, because if they took their own state, they would take a huge part of Turkey's economic structure and its natural resources with them. So Turkey, very anti-Kurdish. Whether it's the Kurds in Turkey or elsewhere, because they believe that if the Kurds begin to gain independence and power and autonomy in any country nearby, that can spread and encourage the Kurds in Turkey to fight for their own autonomy more, and Turkey doesn't want that. The US has a interesting history when it comes to backing the Kurds. Historically, we have occasionally backed them and then backed out at times that were really unfortunate for them. In Iraq in particular, back during the first Gulf War, we told the Kurds, yes, rise up, fight Saddam Hussein, and we will help you. And then we didn't really. The chemical weapons that you hear about Saddam Hussein gassing his own people, right? First, he bought the gas from us. We sold it to him in hopes he would use it against Iran. We don't talk about that a lot, but that's what happened. And second, the people he gassed were the Kurds. So they've kind of been, they've been in I'm sure there are many less polite ways to say this, but they've gotten the short stick in a lot of places. The US has intermittently backed them, but Turkey is also an important ally in the region, both because it's part of NATO and because we want it as a major base to work from in that area. So we've generally been fairly inconsistent in how strongly we back them. Fourth group, ISIS, IS, Daesh, ISIL, a bunch of different names for them, same group. Basically the folks you hear about as the boogeyman on the news a lot. They, interestingly enough, nobody likes these folks. So nobody's on their side. They are against everybody. But, and this is really important, Assad and Russia has strategically avoided attacking or engaging them. And this is a really big deal because they are fighting all of these groups officially, but realistically they're fighting the Kurds primarily and occasionally the Syrian opposition. As the US has helped to decrease ISIS's power and they've declined more and more, all of a sudden now Assad is focusing much more on, sorry, let me rewind for a sec. Assad largely avoided them, but said, because ISIS is running rampant in my country, I must bomb people. The implication being the people he was going to bomb were going to be them. But it wasn't. Russia was like, we must bomb and attack ISIS, as they bombed the Syrian opposition and the Kurds. So ISIS has provided the justification for engagement in military action, not only on the part of the Syrian government, but also on the part of international intervening actors too. So because of that, Assad has had a strategic interest in not getting rid of these folks. Because as long as and he actually released a large number of jihadists from jail at the beginning of the Syrian revolution in hopes of tainting the entire opposition movement with associations with this kind of group. So he could paint them all as jihadist terrorists and get the West to take out his enemies for him. He has largely avoided them because as long as they're there, international forces are going to come in and he is basically able to fight his enemies, who are these folks, and to a slightly lesser degree these folks, though still high on his list, under the pretense of fighting them. As we've been successful against these folks, it means that temporary ceasefires that had been set up here have completely gone away. And Assad has turned almost all of his focus on the Syrian opposition. You'll hear about, what's the name of the town? The UN raised issue. What was it? Yep, Ghouta. The UN has raised issues about it very recently. Assad has a tendency to basically conduct medieval-style sieges where he locks down a town, bombs it, and doesn't allow any supplies in or out, and you just starve the people to death. Worked pretty well in the Middle Ages, and then we decided it was probably a war crime and that we shouldn't do it anymore. But apparently the memo didn't get to everybody, or they ignored it for some reason. Can't imagine why. But that conflict has escalated. The US and Russia have been in close proximity here, which has been a potential flashpoint. There have been a couple times where US and Russian forces, or more specifically the forces they are backing, have come into conflict with one another. There have also been instances where US and Russian jets have come very close to having problems. The fact that this issue is largely going to be wrapping up, because realistically Assad's going to be crushing the Syrian opposition probably within the next year completely, eliminates one of the major flashpoints for potential conflict between the US and Russia, but it also represents a major victory for Russia. They picked a country, they said, we're going to keep this guy in power, the US took the other side, and the US lost. That's definitely the narrative Putin wants to tell people when he's explaining how we are an international power now, we are a power to be reckoned with, we beat our hated opponents. So Syria is someplace where, and this is not to say that U.S. engagement, that more active U.S. engagement would have been better. There's a long debate to be had on how that would have gone down. But either way, this represents a major victory for Russia, especially as it's wrapping up. Any questions here? Yeah, go ahead, sir, and then there.
Well, I'm just going to say that Turkey shut down 2 Russian jets.
Yep.
And Russia did absolutely nothing.
Which frankly was shocking to me. I thought we were going to be on the edge of major escalation. Because remember, Turkey's also keeping a real close eye on what's happening in their neighbor, both because they're worried about these folks getting particularly stabilized, but they're not a huge fan of this guy either. No one in the area really is. Partially it's a religious issue in that Assad is Alawite, which is a subsect of Shia Islam, whereas Turkey, while being officially secular, is predominantly Sunni. So there's a bit of clash there. And Turkey has been moving much more in the Islamist direction in the last decade. So that's part of the issue. But yeah, there have been some surprising instances like that where Russia showed amazing restraint in not expanding it. And I think a lot of the reason is they know if they go after Turkey, then they may come into direct conflict with the US. And a direct conflict there is one they will probably lose, or where the cockroaches will inherit the earth and everyone loses. So they made the strategic calculation to let things like that slide in order to get their victory here. And that's largely paid off for them. So props from an international perspective. Yeah?
Why does Russia want Assad in power?
Partially because he's a check against the US. In that Because the US has largely established a pseudo-puppet state in Iraq, or at least has tried to with varying degrees of success, Assad becomes a check against that. He's also a pseudo-ally of Iran. Remember, Shia, Iran is also Shia. Iran also falls in Russia's sphere of influence. In the Middle East, the US has largely taken the side of the Gulf Emirates, which are all Sunni states, Saudi Arabia being the preeminent one among them. We've largely sided with the Sunnis, where Russia has largely sided with the Shia. And so Assad represents a part of that, and he tacks onto it that way. Yeah?
And way back when, there was the United Arab Republic, which was a client of the Soviets, and that included Egypt and Syria. And Russia has a significant naval base in Syria, so that gives them a place to base ships that can operate in the Mediterranean.
Exactly.
Not behind the Dardanelles or in the Black Sea.
You got it in one. One of the biggest things when you're Russia is getting naval access to wherever you need to go in the world. Because in Europe, there are a lot of places like the Mediterranean or the Black Sea that you can't easily access just because you have access to the Pacific or the Atlantic. So that's a huge chunk of it. Good observations. So, as we mentioned, with IS largely gone, Assad has started going the other direction. Regime's probably going to win soon. What happens to the Kurds then is kind of unknown. It's a question of whether Assad decides that it is worth fighting an extended war against the most organized and well-prepared of his opponents. Like, the Kurds are unified in a way that the Syrian opposition isn't even close to being. They are well-disciplined, they are well-supplied and well-supported, and they have a long cultural history to draw on and a lot of potential support coming from either Iraq or from Kurds who are in Turkey. So taking them on is a much bigger problem, especially now that the Kurds in Iraq have a lot more autonomy and independence than they had before. That makes them a much bigger threat. So whether Assad goes after them in a massive way or not, or lets them, whether he says, you technically are under my rule, you will do what I say. Do what I say. I'm not going to pay attention, but do what I say. I promise, it's all going fine. Totally under my control. What are you doing? Whatever. There's a decent chance it will be control in name only, rather than control in an active way. He'll occasionally do things to antagonize them or to demonstrate power over them, but I don't know that he will necessarily try to territorially take control of that area and actively administer it, because I just don't know that it's worth the effort. We'll have to see how that plays out. A lot of that will also depend on how strongly the US supports the Kurds. And how much Turkey raises hell about it. This is the other thing. Assad is probably going to just sit back, let Turkey violate his borders to kill the Kurds. And that's unfortunately what will likely happen. Last thing, chemical weapons. Been used in Syria a bunch, well, not a bunch, but they've been used several times. Mostly used by the regime, in some cases used by ISIL, though less frequently because they don't have access to them as much, usually stolen from the regime and used by ISIL. In some instances, maybe the Syrian opposition, we're less certain about that, but there's definitely a possibility of it there. But unequivocally been used by the regime, usually chlorine gas or things similar to it, which is pretty horrible. World War I kind of taught us that. So worth noting that that's a thing. There was a big issue where, if you all remember back when we first confirmed Syrian use of chemical weapons, where Obama said this was, the red line, don't cross that. Like, you can do what you want in your own country. When you start breaking the chemical weapons treaty, then we may have to step in. He made the statement, Syria used chemical weapons. Obama said to Congress, oh, they did the thing. We need to go in. Congress said, no. And so we didn't. But Russia also kind of came in to break a potential standoff there and said, we will ensure that Syria gets rid of all of its chemical weapons. So you don't have to you don't have to invade as a result. You just have to make sure that Syria gives up all of them. We will help oversee that. And they kind of did. There are almost certainly stockpiles that were not eliminated, partially because they've been used since then. But a large chunk of them were probably taken out and destroyed. So partial win, also a diplomatic win for Russia. The way it played out was actually really interesting. It was an interview that John Kerry, who was Secretary of State, was doing at the time. And someone asked him, like, is there any scenario where the U.S. doesn't go into Syria? And he said, well, maybe if they give up all their chemical weapons unilaterally, then maybe not. And Russia goes, we can make that happen. And then they do. And Kerry and the U.S. are like, oh, well, they actually did. Oh, okay, fine. So interesting example of Russia diplomatically jumping on a bit of wording and basically gaining some points from the international community, because they avoided what would have been a larger conflict, and they basically used diplomacy to avoid war, which is not usually what you expect of the evil empire. So props for them. Last thing we're going to get, was there another question on Syria real quick before we go? Okay, so let's talk cyber warfare.
That essentially caused ISIS to be defeated? What were the alignments?
By and large, in terms of ISIL's defeat, a couple things were involved. A lot of it was action in Iraq was a huge chunk of what enabled that to happen, combined with US airstrikes in Syria to a more limited degree. Because of the way ISIS moves and because of the way they operate, the campaign that we had been running in Iraq had been a very slow but steady kind of campaign. Trying urban warfare is notoriously deadly and very, very tough to conduct in an effective way. You basically have to set up sieges, set up humanitarian corridors to get people out and hope those people aren't actually the soldiers you're trying to kill, and then block by block take cities. Once the US took Raqqa in Iraq, that was one of the major turning points, because it eliminated one of the major supplies of not only people and resources, but also resupply options for ISIS in Syria. So they've been ground down to a large degree by the Kurds in Syria, who they've been actively antagonizing, and Iraq as well. By and large, the Kurds have beaten ISIS. We helped, but they were the ones on the front lines in addition to the government in Iraq. So very good question. More complicated, but limited time, but that's sort of the overview. So let's talk cyber warfare. Two major things I want to cover here. I want to talk about the ways in which it has been engaged in, and then I want to talk about the goals that Russia has had in employing it, and then we'll see about what we might be able to do about that at the end. Types. Two ways that Russia has gone about engaging in cyber warfare, manipulation, influence, etc. Hacking and manipulating. Hacking. This is where you try to basically get into places you're not supposed to be. Counter to what you may see in the movies, it does not involve like a lot of cool graphic user interfaces and people typing a lot. It usually involves sending a suspicious email and waiting for some dumb person to click the wrong thing, which is actually what happened and how they got into Podesta's emails of the DNC. They sent a phishing email. They sent an email that looked like it was Google saying, someone hacked your account. You need to reset your password. Click this link and type in your new password. They sent that. Podesta sent it to the IT people in the campaign to say, this looks suspicious. What's up? The email back from the IT people was, that is a legitimate email. It was a typo. They meant to say it was an illegitimate email. And he clicked it and boom. So this has been a fairly wide-ranging campaign, not just involving DNC emails, involving lots of other things we don't know a ton of details about yet. But part of what's been really successful here is that the folks who've been engaging in it have largely been backed by the FSB. I think I got that acronym right. It's the foreign, it's basically Russia's equivalent of the CIA, in some ways.
The new KGB.
Yeah, basically KGB Part 2. And the Russian military as well, separate from that. Russia has set up a lot of people with the tools they need to do this kind of thing and to do it effectively. Their claim is these are just anonymous Russian patriots who want to make certain that the democracy in the US is transparent. So we're trying to make sure that all this information, or they, unconnected to us, are trying to make sure that all of this information gets out there for the good of democracy. Yeah, pretty much. So that's a lot of what's been going on the hacking end. Well, actually, let me stick to what I have here. So they made progress in getting into specific emails. We actually don't know if they also got into RNC, Republican emails as well. They may have, and may have declined to leak that information. That's unknown. They made some progress against companies that make voting machines. Diebold, in particular, is one of the big ones. Everything that we know now, they were not able to compromise any vote tallies or anything like that. But they made some progress in trying to get into the company's information and find out more about them. This is something that is of large concern to people. And the Obama administration became aware of this in the last 4 or 5 months of the presidential campaign. And it's actually really interesting looking at the US government response to this, because the Obama government was trying to walk a fairly fine line, because if they come out and say Russians are messing with the election, votes may not be secure and whatnot, they risk delegitimizing the results of the election, which they thought were going to go for someone they supported, which is a problem. And realistically, delegitimizing the results of election is a problem either way, because democracy depends on legitimate elections happening. So there was this desire to not do that, but at the same time to try to counteract what was going on here. So they tried to work with individual state secretaries of state to get voting stuff taken care of there. There was mixed cooperation, and it was fairly limited, but that's what they were trying to do. This time around, there's concern that this may go a step further than it did before, and that Russia may actually be in a position to potentially compromise that. We honestly don't know. part of what becomes we'll get to countermeasures here in a bit. We honestly don't know if there's a higher risk waiting for us here. The likelihood is yes, because we've done very little to counter it, but we don't know the scope of that risk. Manipulation, this is the second thing. This is the lower tech option, but in some ways it's lower risk and lower reward, but much more pervasive. For example, the term fake news first showed up when things like this is the most widely shared story on Facebook for about 4 weeks toward the end of the campaign. It is completely false, and it was created by people out of Russia. This kind of thing became a major issue. There's some interesting, this is another separate discussion, but there's some interesting statistical analysis that shows that, at least this time around, folks on the far right were much more likely to share this information than folks on the far left. We can talk about why that might be if we have more time later, but that's the pattern we've observed so far. Part of that may be that distrust of the mainstream media is something that is much more embraced on the right side of the political spectrum than the left, partially because the mainstream media tends to slide a little bit left. So there's some truth behind that. And thus they're more open to unconventional sources of news, which are also more risky. But in either case, those sorts of stories popped up a ton. There's a second part too, and those are troll accounts on social media. Here, this may be a terminology gap, so if I'm using terms and you're like, what? Let me know, because I am comparatively younger. A troll is not just a thing that hides under a bridge. It is also a person who is a big jerk and makes a point of doing nothing but being a jerk to people and hiding behind anonymity to make sure no one can ever make them accountable for it. So when someone posts a picture of their adorable French bulldog on Facebook, and I, with some random name attached to it, go, that dog is the ugliest thing ever. What kind of horrible person would have a dog like that? You should feel ashamed. I am being a troll. I do not do this as I have a French bulldog and they are awesome, and I also prefer not to be a jerk. But that's the kind of thing we're talking about for trolling. Insults, but also things that involve fanning the flames. And this is a huge part of what Russia actively did. They made a point of doing two things, and we'll talk about their goals in a second and go more in depth, but both promoting a particular political ideology and increasing distrust and antagonism among the American populace. They were actually amazingly successful at both of those, as we'll see in a second. But this part is something that we're getting more and more info on as time goes on. Twitter, a couple weeks ago, deleted a massive number of what are called bot accounts. A bot account is where, instead of me putting up my computer and typing in a thing and having it show up, I set up a program that every time it sees a post from this person that includes these keywords, puts out this pre-scripted post or something like that. And it means you can I, as an individual, could set up thousands of those. So it looks like my message is being amplified to a much, much larger degree than it is, and it looks like a lot more people feel the way I do, which can encourage people who might have otherwise thought their beliefs, neo-Nazi beliefs or other things like that, are too fringe to be spoken in the public sphere. It can encourage them to come forward, make those beliefs more public, and cause more strife and discord and promote hateful or harmful beliefs. That's a lot of the idea behind it. So we've been finding a lot of these accounts, but we're dependent on private companies to do a ton of that. Like, the US government does not have the authority at this point to go into Twitter or Facebook and try to detect which accounts were registered in which countries. That's all private information that we don't have the right or access to. So we're dependent on these companies doing it themselves, and they have they've made some progress, but not a ton. So that gets us to Russia's goals in terms of doing these things. First, the immediate goal, Putin and Clinton did not get along. They actually didn't meet very often, but Putin was not a fan of Clinton. One of the main reasons is that Clinton was a tremendously hawkish foreign policy candidate, at least from a Democratic perspective. The assumption there was that Clinton, so let me rewind for a second. Clinton's approach to foreign policy was more militaristic than most of her contemporaries in the Democratic Party. While she may have been fairly center-left to left on social policy, she tended to be centrist to center-right on a lot of foreign policy. And in particular, Putin thought that she would be someone he would not want to have to engage with and deal with, someone who would put a lot more pressure on him, would cause him a lot more problems. So he did not want her to win. Or at the very least, he wanted her win to be as weak and delegitimized as possible so that he would be dealing with a weak opponent instead of a strong one. There, it seems like promoting Trump was largely secondary. That was the tool by which to defeat Clinton, as opposed to the goal in and of itself. So I think it is false to take away from this the idea that Trump likes Putin, or that Putin likes Trump. The reverse may be true, but Putin, by and large, doesn't seem to care too much about Trump either way. That was the tool by which he could erode what he saw as the more threatening candidate. Second, the targeting of the DNC, and people heard of WikiLeaks, I assume? Yep. Anyone give me a quick synopsis of who or what they are?
It's a website that publishes all kinds of material that people would like to keep secret for one reason or another.
Exactly.
Actors with their views, or politicians. Or
Yeah. It is a website that
WikiLeaks, and they publish it.
pretty much. Yeah, it's a place where secrets, you can send them stuff that isn't supposed to be public, and they will put it up and make it accessible and available. There is some choice in terms of them deciding what they do and don't publish, but for the most part, they put most stuff out there, and they're not going to decide to withhold something because it may be a threat to people. That's not really on their radar. There is a fair amount of evidence suggesting that while WikiLeaks probably was not started by Russia, it is probably fairly strongly influenced or compromised by Russia, and Russia is able to dictate, the Russian government is able to dictate to a decent degree what it does and does not publish, and when it does and does not publish that. Timing is a huge deal here. If you all remember the Donald Trump Billy Bush interview timing, that was almost immediately followed by a massive leak of John Podesta, who was one of Clinton's top people, a massive leak of his emails by WikiLeaks within hours of the Billy Bush thing becoming public as a thing to potentially distract from it. It may have just been a happy coincidence, but it was freaking beautiful timing if you were on that side of the debate. So that's the sort of thing that makes people highly suspect that WikiLeaks is by any means a neutral party. Secondary question is whether the Trump campaign had any coordination there, and we don't freaking know. We'll maybe get that sorted out by Mueller. But Russia definitely seems to have had a hand in doing that as a way to strengthen what they saw as the weaker candidate, undermine the one that they saw as the more threatening. Second goal, undermine the faith in US elections. One of the narratives in Russia that gets put out a lot is that democracy just doesn't work. That what we have here in Russia is the best you can get in basically a flawed world. So don't complain about cronyism, don't complain about corruption. America claims to be the best at all this, and they are terrible at all of it. This is the best you get. Don't complain about it, take it at face value and go with it. It's sometimes referred to as whataboutism. It happened a lot during the Cold War, where people would critique what things that the Russian government was doing, and their response is, well, in the US they lynch Negroes. And they're right, we did, and that was horrible, but that doesn't make what they're doing any better. And that was the refrain that was used a lot by the powers that be in the government to erode people's belief in Russia that things could ever be any better. Because if you don't think things can be better, there's no reason to revolt or rise up or try to change them. So it's a great way to lock the status quo in power. And the more faith in US elections can be undermined both by the US people and internationally, the stronger that narrative is, and the easier it is to maintain power in Russia and shut down any attempts to undermine you or replace you. So that also has the side effect of weakening whoever becomes president. Right? Donald Trump was very unlikely to be a particularly strong president regardless of what happened, but the scandals certainly have not helped that. And from Clinton's perspective, any illegitimacy or perceived illegitimacy in the election would have undermined her as well, which aids you if you're Russia and they're the people you're squaring off against. It also, as we mentioned, supports that Russian domestic agenda. Finally, the third goal, create discord in the American public. And this has been successful beyond anyone in Russia, or beyond Putin's wildest imagination. Polarization in the United States is higher than at any time in recorded history. Higher than the Vietnam era, higher than the peak of Korea, higher than during the civil rights movement. There is more distance between the right and the left now than at any other time that we've been able to measure. And that distance has been building for a little while, but it ratcheted up noticeably during the 2016 election and during the run-up to it. And a lot of that has to do with the social media manipulation that we talked about earlier, right? Where you can fan the flames of extremist views, which causes people on both sides to militarize. It causes people on the side that you are propping up to become more visible and causes outrageous, offensive, and hateful and harmful beliefs to gain more traction, to be heard more, it also causes people on the other side to demonize their opponents and see everyone who's on the other side as being those hate mongers. Because there are so many of them out there, it can't just be a few people, it must be most of the folks I disagree with that are people like that. And that leads to even higher degrees of militarization and polarization on the responding side, as the left in this case becomes more aggressive, then people who are more moderate on the right see that as a reason for them to up their aggression even more, and the cycle spirals. South Park is something that I would only dubiously recommend, but occasionally they have some fairly insightful things, and they did do a fairly insightful thing on how trolling works to massively escalate rhetorical and actual polarization and violence, and it parallels this really well. Yeah?
I'm sorry, but I think that misses one key point.
Sure.
And that is that I believe that, regardless of my personal
Yeah.
political views, I believe there is a segment of politically aware people in this country who are just really pissed off that
Oh, yeah.
black men are elected twice. And I think that factors into this. I
Sure.
don't think anyone is particularly dominant in the thought, but I think that's a very important point here.
Sure, and I'm not disagreeing with you at all there. And I would argue that that is part of why Russia saw this as a golden opportunity. If there's a lot of resentment, even if it's latent and unspoken in some portions of the population, how much we can debate about, but there are probably some people who are not a big fan of that. If there is a degree of resentment there that you can build upon and can give voice to in a way that is not that, because in the US, we have not gotten good at dealing with racism. We have not gotten good at trying to decrease racism. We've gotten really good at teaching people to not talk about racism, which probably is not the end goal. We have decided socially that it is unacceptable to be caught saying racist things. We have not decided socially, at least as much as I personally would prefer, that it is okay, that it is a problem to do things that have racist undertones or create structures of privilege and oppression that advantage some races over others. We haven't gotten to that. It's the, I don't think Donald Trump actually hates black people. I think he would definitely hire a black person who walked into his office. That's not what the argument that most people who are concerned with things like structural racism are really getting into. They're talking about how our society has been set up in ways that it is subconsciously advantage or disadvantage certain people. But because that latent resentment is there, and there's also economic resentment that parallels that in a large portion of the population. I come from Iowa, middle of frickin' nowhere. I have a bit of understanding of some of that in that the nature of globalization has been such that what was previously the path to the American dream, which was a union manufacturing job someplace, largely doesn't exist anymore. And those things are things that become frustrating and build a lot of resentment. And what Russia managed to do, with the help of a number of other folks as well, domestically, is help expand that resentment and target it in specific ways. They've been identifying wedge issues. They actually did this with gun control as well, as recently as Sandy Hook. No, not just recently. They did it with Sandy Hook. They did it with Parkland, Florida, too. They are still doing this, where we found bots, hundreds of them, that are amplifying right-wing conspiracy theories about how the people of Parkland, Florida were paid crisis actors. That story is being boosted by Russian social media bots. And it's not being done because Russia opposes gun control. It's being done because Russia wants people in the US more mad at one another and to see each other as opponents rather than people who are trying to find a solution together. And they're super effective at it. Social media has created a way to enable anonymity. And being immune to reprisal is one of the best ways to get people to do things that are harmful and divisive. And so that gets us to the question of countermeasures. Yeah, this is the other thing. The other example of the Discord is American, what we call tribalism, which is where people have a group that they identify with, and they defend that group against external groups. That has also been massively escalating. Hate crimes have also been up significantly. All examples of that. Yeah?
I think it's interesting how they're not doing it just in the U.S. It seems to be
Yes.
they're doing this in a lot of the European countries.
Yep.
Also, because polarization in a number of the European countries
Oh,
is
yeah.
at its highest level.
Yep, agreed. Very legitimate point. Part of that is a larger trend that's been moving, but it's definitely a trend that they've been stoking the fires of whenever and wherever they have the chance. They just may have been the most unequivocally successful in the US, at least so far as we have seen. But a number of places in Western Europe in particular, they've definitely been pushing that. France has seen that issue, Germany has definitely seen that issue, Italy very recently has seen the outcomes of that issue. So this is not something that is unique to the US by any means, but just for time's sake, I wanted to focus here, but good observation. Let me go ahead, sir.
And just to go with that.
Yeah.
Donald Trump was saying, drain the swamp, let's get rid of the elites on the coast and
Yep.
so on. In Europe, it's drain the Brussels swamp. And,
Yep.
make the EU come apart
Yes.
in ways that are all in Russia's interest. And we're seeing
Yeah.
that happen also. So it really is a technique that's applicable in many areas.
Yeah, it's the promotion of populism, the idea that elitism and expertise are bad, which in some cases they certainly are, but in other cases they most likely are not. Having expertise is occasionally valuable for doing expert things, or doing things that require experience in some degree. But the more that you can promote an anti-intellectualist or anti-elitist bias in some place, the more you can destabilize the most effective mechanism they have of fighting back geopolitically from a diplomatic or economic perspective. Definitely true. So let's get to the future and where this is going. First off, yeah, Russia kicked butt here. Like, they won. Success on pretty much all fronts. There have been almost no consequences to Russia. There were some very small end things that Obama did in retaliation, some of which were reversed by Trump later, some of which were maintained. There's no idea of how long that will take, how long those will stay. U.S. intelligence community is unanimous. Like every national security agency, I think there are like 18 of them, all agree that Russia was directly involved in manipulating the election and that they were doing so to undermine Clinton or to support Trump. And that they will also repeat and expand those attempts in the midterms and also in the next presidential election unless something stops them. Speaking of things stopping them, here are available countermeasures. U.S. State Department has been allocated $120 million to fight this kind of campaign. They have spent zero of those dollars over the last year. Their center, the center that they have for dealing with enemy propaganda has 27 people, analysts working there, zero of whom speak Russian. And this has been a year now since this mandate's been expanded. Most of that historically had been focused on fighting ISIL propaganda and fighting propaganda coming out of the Middle East and some out of Latin America. But one of our big countermeasures we are simply opting to not use. And part of this gets down to how the executive versus the legislative works in the US, in that the legislative can say do stuff, but it doesn't actually happen unless the executive does it. And the perspective of Trump, I'm trying to stay as objective here as I can, so forgive me if this feels shaded. Trump's perspective has largely been, or at least it appears to be, that admission that Russia was involved in the election undermines his legitimacy and suggests that he didn't win himself. And being seen as a winner is very important psychologically, and like everything from the art of the deal to his rhetoric generally, that's something that seems to matter to Trump. So because of that, any discussion of counteracting Russian meddling is largely off the table because that involves acknowledging Russian meddling, which Trump has grudgingly done on a few instances, but by and large has denied. So it means that our executive is very ill-equipped to deal with a very real threat to both social cohesion in the US and also the effective functioning of our democracy. So that's kind of where we are on that level. Yeah?
Doesn't Congress, aren't they the ones who implement sanctions on another nation, though?
Not yes and no. The president has some latitude to do it independently. Congress can overrule that in a lot of instances, but generally when it comes to foreign policy, that's the president.
I thought like Congress increased the sanctions and Trump was saying, I'm not going to veto it, but this is my...
Yes, that happened as well. So the president can do it and can undo it. Congress can also force things to happen and not happen. But ultimately, even if the president signs it, when he starts enforcing those is largely vague. Like the Treasury Department has to do that. That's an executive agency. So in the same way that Trump has said that he's going to reinstate a new set of sanctions but has given no deadline as to when that will happen, just because Congress tells the president to do something and the president signs it doesn't mean it actually gets implemented. And when and how that implementation happens, how effective it is, and how timely it is all up to the executive. Yeah?
In connection with that, I believe the Senate voted 98-2.
98-2, you got it.
Sanctioned Russia over a year ago, and
Yep.
none of that has happened.
Yep, Trump signed it, but hasn't acted on it yet. So officially they exist and are coming at some point. Go ahead, ma'am.
Wouldn't that bring us back to, they're not spending any money to combat this?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that bring us back to the election, say in 2020, the same situation of, maybe they don't want Trump or whatever,
Yeah.
but he seems to be not doing anything,
Yep.
so maybe we do. And so are we gonna then be back to the same thing?
If we don't change, and if we don't do anything to combat it, it is likely that not only will they be as effective as they were this time, but significantly more effective than they were before. Efforts to penetrate voting machines, I think those are 80% scare tactics, but there is a degree of legitimate concern there, and that's something that we need to be doing more about, and we aren't. So yes, this pattern will almost definitely repeat itself, and probably repeat itself in a stronger way, in whatever direction they would choose to favor. But in order to accept that truth, you have to accept that it happened to begin with. And if you don't accept that it happened to begin with, it can't repeat because it never happened. Selective reality. Let me go back there to you, sir. I haven't heard from you in a bit.
One of the things I could use in comment is these multinational companies like Intel or any of these big companies, Amazon, they have so much influence in our government. And are they effective? If they were effective, I think there'll be more action taken against this.
Possible.
I mean, I heard something on the radio today about they don't care about China, taking our technology because they benefit by this, and maybe there's something similar in this case.
Possible. A lot of that will depend on. So there are some benefits to having a weaker executive because it means that you may have more control over what information that executive receives. If the president doesn't have advisors around him or her that can give them useful economic information, they conceivably would then go to executives out in the world and ask them for information, which may give you more influence. So there is that concern. In terms of a direct connection, that I have yet to see, but it doesn't mean that something like that could not potentially emerge. I can take one or two more, and then I want to finish this, and then we'll wrap.
What kind of things could we actually do to combat them?
Good question. And this is something where our options are a little limited. One thing that we can do is much more strenuous enforcement of detection for fake accounts from social media companies. That would probably require a law or potentially a subpoena. An executive order may be able to do it, but basically requiring those companies to actively scan for what appear to be fraudulent accounts created by foreign actors. So that's one thing that could be done. Second is better security systems for our voting machines. It's one of the more potentially vulnerable parts of American infrastructure, and that's something that we can definitely do improvements on. More validation of things once they go through, paper confirmation that comes out of a machine, which right now we don't generally have. Those things are all options. In addition to that, punitive countermeasures are also an option. We can begin doing things to destabilize various Russian-oriented sites or things that their government is affiliated with in some way as a reprisal, so that there is some kind of consequence for doing this sort of thing. Because that's a lot of the problem now is, even if we trace it back there, they just say, it was some patriotic Russians, what are we going to do? Even things like trying to extradite those people and be able to charge them with an international crime of some kind. There's a lot we would need to potentially pursue there. We honestly don't know what a lot of our options are because we haven't examined them yet. And that runs us into some trouble. Go ahead, sir.
The biggest issue with the voting is not the voting machines, but they can wreak havoc with city and state voting records. So in other words, they pull out, let's say you get 10,000 voters in your database, and they go in and pull out half of them. And then they'll go in and vote. Now you've got chaos at all of these polls. So that's a bigger issue.
And that's something that also becomes a much bigger issue because, so the issue is about being able to purge parts of voting records and voting rolls, especially in states where felon disenfranchisement is the case, where if you are convicted of a felony, you lose the right to vote for the rest of your life. There have already been significant allegations and problems where, in particular, African Americans tend to be disenfranchised at a much higher rate there, where there's someone with a similar name to yours that is struck from the voting rolls, so you're struck from the voting rolls as well. Those states are even more vulnerable to that kind of a thing. But yeah, manipulating the actual voting machines, like I said, I think is somewhat far-fetched, but there are definitely other ways to get there, and the voting rolls is an easy and low-hanging fruit option that we really don't do a good job keeping track of.
Yeah, there wasn't any evidence that databases were manipulated this time around.
Correct.
But it's pretty clear that they had access to those names, which means they most likely use those to target
particular
Yeah.
demographics.
And this is one of
That's
the,
going around.
and this is one of the potential scandal windows. So if, I'm going to go a little off track here to Trump-Russia connection, or Trump-team-Russia connection things. There's actually, I think it's Cambridge Analytics is the company it's a company that provides basically voter targeting data for campaigns. This is the subsection of people that have voted in these elections. So these are active voters. These are the demographics of those people. These are their income breakdowns. This is what kind of house they live in. This is how many kids they have in school right now. This is what PTA organizations they visit, all that kind of stuff that lets you as a campaign know these people are worth contacting, these people are not, because these are likely voters and these are not, that kind of thing. The degree to which the social media stuff and the fake news in particular was targeted in Pennsylvania and Ohio in particular was almost surgical. It was targeted at particular people in particular districts at particular places with a degree of precision that would be very surprising if it came entirely from a foreign actor who had not been involved in US election law and in county by county election precinct type stuff. Cambridge Analytics is what provided that information to the Trump campaign. There is some concern that that information may have then been shared with Russia. There is no proof of that at this point. But that is one thing that the investigation there is looking into, and that would be another example of that kind of targeted manipulation that can happen that is a particular degree of vulnerability. As I mentioned, there's been some progress with private companies, including Twitter and Facebook? Yeah, those. Twitter and Facebook in terms of curtailing bot-type accounts and whatnot. Go ahead.
Well, I guess my question is, why does that company have that information on us? How did they get that information on us?
Yep.
Voting is supposed to be private. How did they
Who you vote for, yes. If you voted, that's public knowledge. That's one way that we can critique politicians who don't vote beforehand and then claim to be these upright citizens. Like when you go, we can check, did you vote in these elections? We have no idea which way you voted. That's all private. But did you show up to a polling place and check your name? And that's part of why they're taking names off. So that information is public. Most of the other stuff you can get either through credit reporting agencies. They have an immense amount of information on you. Or you can buy it from companies like Amazon or other companies that track any digital sales that you do. All of those sorts of things are potential sources of information. Like we give away so much of our information without knowing it in a way that can easily be sold and aggregated. And is. Like the information economy is the new place to go. I don't know if y'all are, I'm tangenting off a little bit, but Amazon has a credit card that it's hoping to promote sometime in the next year or two. It'll basically be an Amazon card, and they're targeting it particularly at teenagers, but also at younger folks in general, because there are a lot of people that don't have traditional bank relationships, like they use PayPal or Venmo or something else as they do their banking via their cell phone instead of walking in someplace. And the big reason that Amazon is likely to do that is not just because they might make a little money off it, but they will get to know everything you buy, what time you buy it at, when your paycheck comes in on what day, all of that information, which enables them to target marketing and everything else at you. So that kind of big data stuff is painfully available, and there are almost no restrictions on who it can be sold to and when and how and why, because Congress has not seen any reason to make those restrictions, because the companies that are benefiting from it would very much like them to not make those restrictions. So that's kind of where we're at. Very good question, but sadly, we don't have a great answer to it. So this last thing here is something I want to take just a minute. Are we over? Oh, we're over time. I'll wrap up in the next 2 minutes and then shut up. This is something that I think is definitely worth a larger discussion if we can do it. And that's the term fake news. Now you hear it most commonly from Donald Trump referring to any news that he disagrees with. But it initially had a fairly specific meaning, and that was things created out of whole cloth that were fundamentally untrue. The Pope endorses Donald Trump as the classic example there. And because that term has been diluted, because it's been applied to anything that is unflattering rather than things that are patently untrue, it means that we are much less willing and much less aware of whether or not of the fact that highly inaccurate information exists out there. There's also a larger systemic issue, and this is Keith as a teacher talking. One of the things that we don't do enough training for our students is the way the world works has fundamentally changed. I mean, it used to be that knowing facts was important because it was going to take you a bunch of time and a couple books to look that fact up if you didn't know it offhand. I have a portal to the sum total of all human knowledge in my pocket over here, and Wikipedia can find me pretty much anything that exists with 99.8% accuracy in the span of 10 seconds. So memorizing facts and information, largely useless in our world. What matters is teaching people how to consume and find information rather than information to memorize. Being able to sort through what is and is not a credible source. Being able to identify bias. Being able to cut through fake attempts to overly sensationalize things. Detecting fake news is a huge part of what we need to be teaching, and we're not yet. We probably will be in 10 or 15 years, but we need money to develop new curriculums and whatnot, and that's not exactly where our national budget priorities are. So it means that one of the main ways to defeat perhaps the most effective tool Russia has been using is predicated on us expanding a system that our current government is very interested in cutting, which does not bode particularly well for us. In terms of where we are and where we go from here, the best thing I think that we can do, honestly, is to be informed and to be critical. I'm sorry, counterattack we got to briefly. Be informed and be critical of things. And this is personal perspective from me at least, but there's some really good psychological evidence out there. Confirmation bias is something I expect some of you might be familiar with, that we tend to believe things that support what we already think much more readily than we believe things that oppose our beliefs. So I've come to the point where anytime I read a news article, if I agree with it, I immediately stop and go and try to find a second article from a different site that confirms it, ideally in a mainstream source. If I don't find that, I don't accept it as true. Because there is such a massive proliferation out there and so little degree of filter that it's a massive threat. Your local library is also an amazing place to go because they're people who literally, their expertise is information and what constitutes good and bad information. I find it interesting that I think libraries are going to continue to be amazingly relevant in society, not just for things like this, but also for teaching people how to consume information. It's a whole new feature, but it's a really important one. So that's where I see us going. We're a little over time, so I will shut up. But if any of you all have other questions, feel free to come on up and chat. Thank you all for being here. I hope it was enjoyable.